So I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, well, you know what? It would be a kind of a miserable guy that didn't celebrate a birthday like that. As I started thinking, well...
You're standing on top of the world, hearing 50,000 fans scream your name, while a voice inside you whispers that you are completely worthless. That was the brutal duality of Mick Hucknall. He conquered global charts with a velvet voice, yet spent decades running from a ghost. Behind the multi-platinum albums and a chaotic trail of 3,000 lovers lay a deeply buried childhood trauma. It's time to look past the smooth soul and expose the real Mick Hucknall, or should we say, his own exposé. Time to expose everything. There's surely a need to rewind the tape far beyond the stadium lights and glamorous international tours to understand the man who became the unmistakable face, voice, and driving force behind Simply Red. You have to go all the way back to a cold, gray, working-class flat in Denton, Lancashire, during the mid-60s. Mick was not born into wealth, nor was he handed a golden ticket to the music industry. Instead, he was born into an environment that would inflict a devastating emotional wound before he was even old enough to fully understand the world around him. The defining earthquake of Hucknall's entire existence hit when he was just 3 years old. His mother, Maureen, packed her bags, walked out the front door, and never came back. In the context of mid-60s British society, a mother completely abandoning her toddler was incredibly rare, highly taboo, and carried a heavy, unspoken social stigma. Mick was left behind to be raised entirely by his father, Reggie, a quiet, hard-working, stoic barber who suddenly found himself playing both parental roles under intense economic and emotional pressure. Reg did his absolute best, pouring his energy into keeping a roof over his son's head. But the domestic silence left by Maureen's sudden departure was deafening. For a 3-year-old boy, logic, adult reasoning, and nuance do not exist. When a mother vanishes from a child's life, that child doesn't rationalize her absence by blaming her personal struggles, mental health, or relationship failures. Instead, the child turns inward. A toddler processes abandonment through a lens of absolute self-blame. That devastating rejection baked a profound subconscious lie directly into the core of Mick's developing identity. If the very first woman who brought me into this world didn't find me worthy of her presence or her love, then I must be fundamentally unlovable. This toxic belief system became the baseline of his psyche, a quiet, humming anxiety that he would carry into his teenage years and, eventually, into the chaotic epicenter of global megastardom. Decades later, that gaping psychological wound collided head-on with the insane, unregulated, and highly predatory engine of 80s music fame. When Simply Red's debut album blew up on an international scale, Hucknall was suddenly handed an infinite blank check of ultimate external validation. Almost overnight, he went from a struggling, frustrated musician in Manchester to a global icon with millions of dollars, immense industry power, and an endless line of admirers throwing themselves at his feet. The universe was suddenly telling him he was adored by millions, yet the quiet voice from his childhood flat was still whispering the exact opposite. And that is where the absolute chaos truly began. In a bombshell public confession in 2010, Mick finally chose to speak out, laying his cards on the table and exposing the dark, exhausting reality of his peak years. He delivered a shocking public apology to the legions of women he had used, discarded, and cycled through during the height of his fame. Hucknall admitted that between the years of 1985 and 1993, he was actively sleeping with up to 3,000 women. At the absolute zenith of Simply Red's commercial power, he was living like an out-of-control kid, trapped in a hyper-sexualized candy store. It was a lifestyle that frequently involved hooking up with 3 different women a day, shifting seamlessly between groupies, fans, supermodels, and elite Hollywood celebrities. The predatory British tabloids had an absolute field day with this persona, gleefully painting Hucknall as a cartoonish, arrogant, red-headed playboy who was simply collecting notches on his bedpost. But looking back with the clear, sober lens of mature hindsight, Mick exposed a much darker, far more tragic truth beneath those staggering numbers. It was never actually about physical pleasure, ego, or rock and roll bragging rights. It was a severe textbook addiction. He was using women as a literal flesh and blood substance to numb a lifelong internal ache that refused to go away. Every single romantic conquest, every brief hotel room encounter, was a desperate, fleeting attempt to build an emotional fortress against the lingering ghost of his mother. He admitted that he was constantly searching for the fierce, unconditional female love he had been denied as a 3-year-old toddler, projecting that impossible, heavy expectation onto thousands of brief, superficial encounters. He desperately wanted these women to love him, to validate his existence, and to prove the voice in his head wrong. However, the moment any relationship threatened to become genuinely intimate or real, his deep-seated fear of abandonment would violently kick in. Convinced that they would eventually leave him just like his mother did, Mick's defense mechanism was to sabotage the connection and run away first. This profound psychological coping mechanism created a spectacular, high-profile, and deeply volatile mess in his daily life. The music industry in the late 80s and early 90s was notorious for enabling ultimate excess, and Hucknall threw himself completely into the deep end just to keep his inner demons quiet. The paparazzi hounded his every move, capturing a relentless, revolving door of high-profile romances with world-famous supermodels, actresses, and international pop stars. Yet, behind the scenes, this lifestyle was actively eroding his mental health. He quickly gained an industry-wide reputation for being highly combative, defensive, and volatile during media interviews. Whenever journalists tried to probe beneath his ultra-confident, brash exterior, Hucknall would violently lash out or completely shut down. The sheer, crushing pressure of being the sole focal point and creative dictator of Simply Red, combined with an exhausting, non-stop global touring schedule and a nocturnal lifestyle fueled by adrenaline and substance abuse, pushed him directly to the absolute brink of total emotional and physical burnout. He was hopelessly trapped in a vicious, agonizing cycle. The lonelier and more unworthy he felt inside, the more aggressively he chased external physical validation. But the more he chased it, the more hollow, isolated, and fractured his actual human existence became. Managing this level of profound internal chaos would have easily destroyed lesser artists, driving them straight into a definitive career collapse or a tragic, premature end. However, Hucknall possessed a unique, almost stubborn survival instinct that kept him anchored to the earth. His primary, most effective tool for managing the madness was the music itself. He discovered that he could channel his unresolved maternal abandonment, his rage, and his desperate longing directly into his songwriting. When you listen closely to the heartbreaking, melancholic lyrics of Holding Back the Years, a track he remarkably began writing when he was a frustrated 17-year-old kid sitting in his dad's house, you aren't just listening to a smooth, easy-listening radio hit. You are listening to a profoundly traumatized teenager trying to visually and musically process the wreckage of a broken home and an absent mother. By taking his deepest, darkest, psychological wounds and masterfully transforming them into beautiful, universally relatable pop soul art, he found a brilliant way to compartmentalize his pain. On stage, under the absolute protection of his music and his towering vocal talent, he was completely in control of the narrative. No one could abandon him while he held the microphone. Off stage, he used the rigid, uncompromising discipline of the recording studio and the absolute dictatorial authority he held over the changing lineup of Simply Red to keep his daily life from completely derailing into the tragic statistics that ultimately claimed so many of his 80s pop peers. Yet, this frantic, decades-long sprint away from his own shadow could not last forever. The 2010 public confession was not just a random media stunt or a casual interview. It was a profound public exhalation. It was the definitive moment Mick Hucknall finally stopped running, forced himself to look back at the emotional wreckage of his Playboy years, and openly acknowledged the lonely, terrified little boy from Manchester who had started it all. He realized he had to expose his own deep flaws and vulnerabilities to the world before he could even begin the slow, painful process of healing them. But how does a broken, abandoned kid from Manchester turn a private, localized trauma into a multi-platinum, stadium-filling, global empire? The Manchester punk roots and the birth of Simply Red. This wasn't the era of slick, polished pop production. It was the era of raw energy, political unrest, and the DIY revolution of punk rock. For a young, frustrated Hucknall, this chaotic cultural explosion provided the perfect outlet for his internal aggression and deep-seated emotional pain. He didn't lock himself away to grieve his childhood. Instead, he stepped directly into the center of a musical firestorm that was about to change the world. The ultimate catalyst for Mick's transformation arrived on June 4, 1976. That night, an underground London band called the Sex Pistols walked onto the stage at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall. The gig is widely mythologized as the concert that changed the world, and for good reason. The crowd was tiny. Barely 40 people were in attendance, but the room was packed with the future architect generals of British alternative music. Sitting in that audience alongside a young Hucknall were Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner, who would form Joy Division and New Order; Stephen Patrick Morrissey, the future frontman of the Smiths; Mark E. Smith of The Fall; and Tony Wilson, the visionary who would found Factory Records. Watching Johnny Rotten sneer at the audience, Mick didn't just see a band, he saw an escape hatch. Punk rock laid out a brand new set of rules. You didn't need to be a virtuoso, you didn't need permission from a major label, and you certainly didn't need a happy background. You just needed a microphone and enough raw nerve to scream your truth to anyone who would listen. Within weeks of that legendary show, Mick gathered a group of local musicians and formed his very first band, the Frantic Elevators. The Frantic Elevators were a classic, fast and loud post-punk outfit. They spent 7 grueling years slugging it out in the damp, unforgiving independent circuit of northern England. Mick, sporting a wild mane of untamed red hair and an intense, combative stage presence, poured his teenage frustration into fast tempos and jagged guitar riffs. The band released a handful of obscure singles on local labels, including tracks like Voice in the Dark and Searching for the Only. They even caught the ear of legendary BBC Radio 1 DJ John Peel, who gave them brief flashes of national airplay. Yet, despite their relentless gigging and critical praise from the local music press, the band was constantly hitting a brick wall. They were playing to tiny, half-interested crowds in dingy pubs, selling minimal copies of their vinyl records, and barely making enough money to cover their petrol costs. By the early 80s, the initial shock factor of the punk movement was rapidly fizzling out, and Hucknall was growing deeply disillusioned with the self-imposed limitations of the underground scene. It was during this period of mounting frustration that Mick had a profound artistic realization. The Frantic Elevators were forcing him to sing in a harsh, aggressive style that actively suppressed his actual talent. Deep down, he didn't possess the flat, monotone vocal delivery of a standard punk singer. He had a generational, soaring vocal range deeply rooted in classic American soul, gospel, and rhythm and blues. He had spent his childhood listening to vocal titans like Otis Redding, Barry White, and Marvin Gaye. He realized he was trying to fit a massive, stadium-sized soul voice into a tiny, distorted punk rock box. The turning point for the band arrived in 1982 when they recorded their final definitive single, a slower, melancholic, and deeply bluesy track called Holding Back the Years. It was a complete departure from their usual frantic pace. The song showcased the true power, vulnerability, and emotional depth of Mick's voice. While the single won critical acclaim, it failed to achieve commercial success. And by 1984, after 7 years of exhausting struggle, the Frantic Elevators officially disbanded. But Mick wasn't defeated. He was liberated. He knew Holding Back the Years was a masterpiece, and he knew he needed a brand new musical vehicle to unleash his soul sensibilities onto the mainstream market. He immediately set to work recruiting a fresh collective of seasoned Manchester musicians, including keyboardist Fritz McIntyre and guitarist David Fryman. They needed a name that stood out, something that paid homage to Mick's lifelong allegiance to Manchester United, his left-wing political views, and his undeniable crown of ginger hair. They settled on a name that would soon become a permanent fixture on the global charts: Simply Red. In 1985, Simply Red signed a major record deal with Elektra Records and unleashed their debut album, Picture Book. The lead single, a powerhouse cover of the Valentine Brothers' Money's Too Tight to Mention, exploded into the UK top 20, perfectly capturing the financial anxieties of mid-80s Britain. But the true earthquake occurred when Mick decided to dust off Holding Back the Years, re-recording it with a lush, smooth, and world-class soul production. The track soared to #1 on the US Billboard Hot 100, turning an abandoned kid from Manchester into an overnight international superstar. Suddenly, the world belonged to Simply Red. But keeping a band together when you are the undisputed captain is easier said than done. The music, the hits, and the rotating door. Now we have to look past the tabloid headlines and dive into the sheer mechanics of their musical output to truly see how Simply Red dominated the global charts for over a decade. Mick Hucknall was not just a singer who happened to front a group. He was the absolute architect, CEO, and creative dictator of the entire brand. While the public viewed Simply Red as a traditional democratic band collective, the reality inside the studio was entirely different. From day one, Mick operated under a simple, uncompromising philosophy. Simply Red was a solo project operating under a corporate banner. This strict operational hierarchy allowed him to steer the music with laser focus, but it also transformed the band into a notorious revolving door for musicians. The sonic identity of Simply Red was defined by a masterful blending of American soul, reggae, jazz, and sophisticated British pop. Mick possessed a rare encyclopedic knowledge of rhythm and blues, which he utilized to craft hooks that were simultaneously timeless and commercially radio-friendly. Following the explosive global success of their debut album Picture Book, Hucknall did not rest on his laurels. He immediately began pushing the band into a more polished, upscale production territory. The breakthrough peak of this sonic evolution arrived with their landmark 1989 album, A New Flame, which featured a powerhouse cover of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes' If You Don't Know Me By Now. The track became a massive worldwide #1 hit, earning a Grammy nomination and solidifying Mick's reputation as one of the finest blue-eyed soul vocalists on the planet. However, everything they had achieved up to that point was merely a warm-up for the creative and commercial juggernaut that arrived on September 30th, 1991, Stars. Working alongside veteran producer Stuart Levine at the historic Condulmer studio in Venice, Italy, Mick set out to write an album consisting entirely of original material, moving completely away from the covers that had previously defined their biggest radio hits. The recording sessions were intense, precise, and entirely driven by Mick's perfectionism. He meticulously tracked every vocal layer, rearranged horn sections on the fly, and demanded absolute technical precision from his studio musicians. The resulting album was nothing short of a masterpiece. Stars was a flawless, upbeat, yet deeply introspective collection of tracks that captured the cultural zeitgeist of the early 90s. The record spawned 5 massive hit singles, including the jazz-infused Something Got Me Started, the tender For Your Babies, and the wistful, dreamy title track, Stars. The commercial performance of the album defied all industry expectations. In the United Kingdom, Stars debuted at #1 and went on to become the best-selling album of the entire year for both 1991 and 1992 consecutively. It was a historic chart feat that hadn't been accomplished since Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water 2 decades prior. By the middle of 1993, Stars had sold over 8.5 million copies worldwide, earning 12 times platinum certification in the UK alone, and outperforming global releases by titans like Michael Jackson and U2. Yet, as the stadiums grew larger and the multi-platinum plaques piled up, the internal friction within the camp grew increasingly toxic. The massive success of Stars highlighted the sharp disparity between Mick Hucknall and the rest of the touring band. Mick was the primary songwriter, the unmistakable visual icon on every album cover, and the sole beneficiary of the lucrative publishing royalties. The other musicians, many of whom had contributed significantly to the lush live arrangements and relentless promotional tours, were essentially treated as high-paid contract employees. This top-down corporate structure inevitably led to deep resentment, bitter financial disputes, and explosive creative clashes behind closed doors. Mick made no apologies for his dictatorial leadership style. In his view, a democracy could never produce a cohesive artistic vision. He openly admitted that he ran Simply Red with an iron fist to protect the integrity of the music and to prevent the band from dissolving into typical creative compromises. If a musician expressed dissatisfaction with their salary, questioned his songwriting choices, or failed to meet his exacting standards on stage, they were promptly dismissed and replaced by the next session musician in line. Key founding members, including keyboardist Fritz McIntyre, eventually walked away after years of navigating Mick's intense personality and rigid control. By the mid-90s, the rotating door of bassists, drawers, and horn players had spun so fast that Simply Red had ceased to look like a band at all. It was simply Mick Hucknall plus a collection of world-class backing talent. This absolute control allowed Mick to maintain an incredibly high standard of musical consistency throughout the decade. He proved his commercial instincts yet again in 1995 with the release of Life, which delivered the band's very first UK #1 single, the infectious, electronic-tinged track, Fairground. Mick had successfully adapted his soul sensibilities to the emerging club culture of the mid-90s, proving that his ear for a hit was as sharp as ever. But the constant cycle of writing, recording, managing personnel, and fighting off the predatory British tabloids was beginning to exhaust even his legendary work ethic. He had achieved total artistic victory, amassed a massive fortune, and proven his detractors wrong at every turn. But the burden of carrying a multi-million-dollar global brand entirely on his own shoulders was becoming unsustainable. Yet, as the stadiums grew larger and the hits kept coming, the relentless machinery of fame began to take its toll. The solo detours, the hiatus, and the 40th anniversary revival. By the late 2000s, Mick Hucknall found himself standing at a major crossroad. The formula that had sustained Simply Red for over 2 decades was beginning to feel less like an artistic vehicle and more like a predictable, albeit lucrative, obligation. He had achieved everything a working-class kid from Manchester could possibly dream of. But the non-stop cycle of recording and touring under that famous moniker was grinding him down. Mick realized that if he wanted to grow as a musician, and more importantly, as a human being, he needed to step away from the massive pop-soul machine he had built. He needed to find out who he was without the security blanket of his famous band. The definitive break came in 2010. Coinciding with his monumental personal shift and his public confessions, Mick announced that Simply Red would be calling it quits. It wasn't a bitter, chaotic breakup sparked by internal band warfare. It was a highly organized, deliberate retirement. Mick launched a massive emotional farewell tour that spanned the globe, giving millions of loyal fans one last chance to hear the classics live. When the final curtain dropped at London's O2 Arena in December 2010, it felt like the absolute end of an era. The red-headed titan was walking away from the pop charts on his own terms, leaving behind a flawless commercial legacy. But a vocalist of Hucknall's caliber cannot stay silent for long. The hiatus from Simply Red didn't signal his retirement from music. Instead, it opened the door for a series of fascinating, highly unexpected solo detours that allowed him to explore his rawest musical roots. Freed from the commercial expectation of delivering chart-topping pop soul anthems, Mick pivoted toward his deepest musical loves: classic rhythm, blues, and heritage rock. His first major solo project during this period was a deeply personal tribute album titled Tribute to Jack Johnson, followed later by American Soul, where he covered the foundational tracks that had shaped his vocal style as a teenager. He stripped away the polished synthesizers and slick horn arrangements of his 90s peak, opting instead for a gritty, organic, and live-in-the-studio sound. His vocals on these tracks were rawer and more blues-infused than anything he had released under the Simply Red banner, proving to cynical music critics that his voice possessed a timeless, genre-defying gravity. Perhaps the most surprising detour of his hiatus arrived when he received an unexpected phone call from British rock royalty. The legendary rock band The Faces, originally fronted by Rod Stewart and featuring iconic guitarist Ronnie Wood, were planning a reunion but needed a powerhouse vocalist who could match Rod's legendary grit and stage presence. They turned to Mick Hucknall. Stepping into Rod Stewart's shoes is widely considered an impossible task in the rock world, but Mick accepted the challenge with absolute confidence. He toured with The Faces, fronting the iconic rock outfit at major festivals and high-profile charity gigs. Clad in sharp suits and channeling old-school rock and roll swagger, Mick stunned audiences by delivering blistering, high-energy rock vocals that proved he was far more than just a smooth soul singer. Yet, no matter how rewarding these solo experiments were, the ghost of his past creation continued to linger. By the mid-2015 mark, the itch to return to his life's work became impossible to ignore. Mick realized that Simply Red wasn't just a chapter he could close forever. It was his ultimate identity. He missed the specific chemistry of his catalog and the unmatched feeling of hearing arenas sing his original lyrics back to him. In 2015, to mark the 30th anniversary of the band's formation, Mick Hucknall launched Simply Red back into the cultural mainstream with a brand new studio album titled Big Love and a massive sold-out reunion tour. The fans returned in droves, proving that the public's appetite for his signature sound hadn't diminished in the slightest. This triumphant return set off a powerful second wave of creativity and touring that has carried Mick directly into the present day. Rather than resting on a nostalgia loop, he continued to write new music, releasing the critically acclaimed album Time in 2023. This resurgence has culminated in a historic, massive milestone, the celebration of Simply Red's 40th anniversary. To honor 4 decades of global musical dominance, Mick and his current lineup of world-class touring musicians launched a monumental 40th anniversary tour across the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Europe. Night after night, in packed arenas from Manchester to London and Paris, the 66-year-old vocalist has taken to the stage to deliver performances that defy his age. Fans and critics alike have been left stunned by the absolute preservation of his vocal cords. Mick is still hitting the soaring, emotionally piercing high notes of Holding Back the Years and Stars in their original keys with total, effortless precision. The tour has transformed from a simple concert series into a triumphant, generational victory lap for an artist who was once written off by the punk underground. So, when the microphones turn off and the stadium lights finally dim, who is the man left standing in the quiet? The quiet vanguard. The answer is a stark, peaceful contrast to the chaotic whirlwind of his youth. The man who once lived to chase validation through the relentless nocturnal habits of an international rock star has undergone a definitive, hard-won transformation. Mick Hucknall's ultimate victory didn't take place on a Billboard chart or a sold-out stadium stage. It took place within the boundaries of his own private life. He finally achieved the ultimate maturity by dismantling the out-of-control playboy identity that had previously threatened to consume him, trading the superficial roar of the crowd for a grounded, quiet existence anchored by family and connection. The definitive turning point of this redemption arc arrived when he built the stable family unit he had spent an entire lifetime running away from. In 2010, the exact same year he paused Simply Red to address his past, Mick married his longtime partner, Gabriella Wesbury, in a romantic ceremony at a 16th-century castle in Scotland. Together with their daughter, Romy True, Mick finally discovered the peaceful rhythm of domestic stability. The man who had slept with thousands of women in a desperate search for unconditional love finally found it in the quiet routine of fatherhood and marriage. To maintain this hard-won peace, Mick actively distanced himself from the toxic British tabloid machine. He repositioned his life across the scenic, rugged landscapes of Western Europe. He developed a deep passion for viticulture, settling down in Catania, Sicily, to carefully cultivate his own boutique wine label appropriately named Il Cantante, which translates directly to the singer. When he isn't checking on his Sicilian vineyards, he retreats to the rugged, serene expanses of the Glenmore estate in County Donegal, Ireland. In Ireland, he spends his days as an avid, quiet fisherman, trading the noise of the music industry for the gentle rushing of local rivers. Hucknall's story is a powerful testament to survival. Those dramatic, low-effort clickbait videos continue to scour his past, looking for manufactured scandals because they simply cannot comprehend the beautiful complexity of his real-world redemption. He evolved from an abandoned, traumatized kid in Manchester to a volatile pop icon, and finally, to a peaceful, well-adjusted, musical elder statesman. He didn't let his childhood trauma define his end. Instead, he used his voice to sing through the pain, outrun his demons, and build a lasting legacy entirely on his own terms. If you want to keep tracking the real stories behind music's biggest icons, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.